What about human waste disposal, Dennis? I mean, animals ingest, digest, and excrete. Now, what are we going to do to handle the human excrement and urine? I mean, that seems to me that not to be taken into account here.
Well, I'm going to say something that's going to sound rather disgusting, but in the aggregate, you probably would have wanted to conserve the urine and filter it in a fashion where you could, reduce it to basic water again, notwithstanding the waste byproducts that get carried out of the human body and urine, because you have a very big problem here, hauling enough water to be able to sustain life with these guys, because everybody exhales a few pints of water every single day in just their breath. It's carried out of the body by exhalation.
And Dennis, I never heard any discussion of food. What were the foodstuffs for the astronauts during this vast trip?
Well, they show all these packages of freeze-dried foods that were compressed into little packets, but they didn't really spend much time showing these astronauts actually eating anything, because you'd think at least during some of the videos they'd be snacked to keep their metabolism going, and you don't see them drinking any fluids or anything like that. Now, I wouldn't think that it would have been out of the question to show these guys actually having a meal, just like when Kubrick shot 2001: A Space Odyssey. He's got at least a couple scenes in there where the astronaut sitting in front of a tray of different colored goo, forking it into his face and drinking from a container inside the Discovery on their way to Jupiter. So, I mean, if we can go so far as to make a movie about space travel, you'd think that at least in some way they would have explained to us how much food they had on board. By the way, you can't find any data anywhere on the NASA website about how many gallons of water they took, how much food they took. What did they do with the human waste in the aftermath of getting rid of it? I mean, there's a dearth of information that should be there if we really did science.
I think the quantity about water alone would be devastating.
Absolutely, because they had to use the water inside the spacesuit, per NASA's own description of how they cooled the astronauts, because they actually expel water in the vacuum of space to carry the heat out of the suit. And by any man's estimation, the amount of water that they would have had to carry, they said the endurance for the suits out in the wild was approximately 4 hours, when the amount of water that they said was in the suit was far less. In other words, it couldn't have possibly worked.
Dennis, I can't believe they got away with this cock and bull story, that anyone bought it. I mean, it's ridiculous from beginning to end, all of it.
It's a nice dream, it's a nice fantasy, like when you're in that waking state, in the moments just before you get fully awake, you're having a nice dream about something that is not real, and it's so wonderful. It has a happy ending, not the funny happy ending we're talking about in the other episodes of other stuff, but just before you wake up, you have that pleasant thing of, wow, what a cool dream that was. But then, by virtue of the fact that none of the science was backed up by any testing, and then everybody was, well, that's absurd to make that claim that NASA tested. Well, show me the hardware, show me the test chambers, show me the test data. I looked at some of the charts that Grumman put out about temperature control on the LEM. It's completely absurd. Nobody with any engineering background can look at that data and not decry that it's absolute utter BS.
And look at this artist's rendering of the control display panels.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the multitudinous complexity of all the circuit breakers and the panels and stuff like this. But the thing is that I'm not going to say that these guys were dummies, because they're not dummies. But you would have wanted to try to do as much as you could to give these guys a real advantage. And the one thing that I looked for very, with a great deal of searching, looking at close-up shots, by the way, of the panels, is I was looking for a very nice, clear shot of a radar altimeter display. And aircraft, they've changed over the years. It used to be a round dial with a pointer that showed you your altitude, and you'd want that on the panel for sure, and probably at least 2 locations, primary and a backup. But over time, in later years, that became a strip with an indicator that with the dial rotating behind it and changing and displaying the absolute surface, distance from the aircraft. And you don't see that, and that would have been a fundamental flight instrument to make the descent to the surface, and it's not there. I don't see any display on that panel that shows these guys how high above the moon they were. And without that, the astronaut would be flying blind with absolutely no
Sure.
clue.
Right. How could they land if they don't know their altitude closing with the surface of the moon? They'd crash.
And the other thing that's really impossible, I want to mention this, and I don't want to spend 40 minutes here talking about it, but a human being cannot make all the necessary computational adjustments within his brain to make a landing of this complexity and be able to control pitch and yaw and descent rate without overshooting and going into what I call a phugoid, aviation term for an oscillation gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you overcorrect and make more of a mistake on the second correction. We only had so much fuel on board this craft. The guys couldn't spend 4 hours trying to get it right until they finally made the landing. They didn't have that option. They had a very finite amount of time to do it in, and they had very little option in the case that they got out of control other than to completely abort and separate this vehicle from the base of the LEM and reascend back up to the command module, which, by the way, that's a whole other problem. We're going to talk about it when we get deeper into this, but we can move on forward here.
Well, here's about Apollo level lunar liftoff HD, Dennis. I may be able to move past this rapidly, but I mean, what we have is a series of frames here that are supposed to be from the liftoff. And can you see it now? Here's one of the frames that's supposed to be during the liftoff.
Actually, I think this shot here is we're actually looking at what might have, I don't know if this is one from the liftoff. This looks like one of the frames from the landing, but I want to talk about the liftoff very, very carefully here because we don't want to brush over it. In at least 2 videos, we show the LEM, or what we call the ascent module, separating from the base and going up and rejoining the command module. Well, there's a problem with this because you see little sparkly, things where the explosive bolts are allegedly popping, and then the thing violently flies off of the base instantly. I mean, pops up like it was propelled by a giant spring. And that rocket motor on the ascent module would have had to have been firing before that thing came off the base. In one case, the engine doesn't appear to start until I think it's between 11 and 17 seconds after the thing is in the air or in the lunar atmosphere, lack of atmosphere. But after lifted off, the engine doesn't start till a ways out. And the other thing that's obviously not there on the base of the LEM, they would have had to have vents on the vehicle to allow for the ascent engine to fire and to build up enough thrust. And it would take a few moments for that thing to lift off. It wouldn't spring off the base because the explosive bolts couldn't have possibly propelled such a heavy vehicle. And by the way, we're talking about more than a few tons here into a higher orbit above the moon. What we're talking about here is complete photographic fakery. And then there's another artifact that is clearly fake, where they show the camera, which is allegedly mounted on the lunar rover, perfectly in perfect timing, panning and following this as it's happening, when the control for that camera is on Earth, and there's a radio delay factor that would have prohibited positive control of the camera to capture the whole thing like that. So we have a lot of fakery here going on, and the average person in America could believe that that thing can spring up into space like pop off of the base of it, but it doesn't work like that, people. It doesn't happen like that. In real life, that thing would have had to lift off and accelerate and go up, not just pop off like somebody propelled it with several large springs. It doesn't work like that.
Here's another image, Dennis. This
one's clearly from the landing itself. This one, I was looking at it with a great deal of bemusement, because here again, there's no dust. They show this distortion or this haziness where the surface detail is not there. But you would have seen a cloud of dust. By the way, on the landing itself, if you wanted to believe that their assessment of 1/6 gravity compared to Earth was correct, a fine cloud of dust would have existed around this vehicle for more than an hour after the landing, and yet it didn't happen.
Right, because it wouldn't have the gravitational strength to bring it down fast the way it would on Earth.
They would have taken a very, very long time to settle. By the way, they probably wouldn't have seen
Except, of course, there's no atmosphere, Dennis. Wouldn't the argument be that it wouldn't remain suspended at all?
No, because the thing is that you don't have to have it. You can have particles suspended in a vacuum. You don't have to have an atmosphere. In other words, you don't have to have air resistance to suspend particles. all you have to do is have a void, and then have particles, so fine that they don't have enough mass for the weak gravity on the moon to pull them back down in a hurry. In other words, they wouldn't instantly fall back down to the lunar surface because the attraction wasn't that great. But you wouldn't have any air carrying these things around like what you see blowing the flag around, which is absurd. When you see there's at least 3 videos showing the flag waving around in a very, very strong wind that couldn't possibly exist. And you can make all the excuses you want that was from the mechanism, but you know what? It doesn't work like that. The mechanism couldn't cause that thing to flap around like it's in the breeze. I'm sorry. That's absurd. That's goofy. It's stupid.
Oh, yeah, I know. They even claim that the flag was just designed with those wrinkles, and when they were putting the flag in, that they turned the pole, and that caused it to flap. But you can clearly see in other of the videos that it's flapping in a non-existent breeze.
Yeah, there's no atmosphere whatsoever.
There's no atmosphere, so it's preposterous. But, those diehard defenders, the Apollo nutters, as they're calling it, the parallel, lone nutters who think that Lee Oswald killed JFK, they insist that this is bona fide and there's nothing odd about it just because it's such a blatant reputation.
No, it's an absolute sign of severe fakery. And once again, the problem that most Americans would have is they can't even wrap their minds around simple sleighs of hand. And this is about as simple as it gets. There's no atmosphere. There's no wind. It's not possible to have wind blowing on the lunar surface. Yet the flag absolutely shows that there is wind blowing that flag. I'm sorry, it's not a mechanical issue.
Yeah, I've looked at it too, and there's no doubt about it. Tell us about this image, Dennis.
This is the practice device for Earth practice of trying to land on the lunar surface. And this shot is taken. It's a screenshot from a test where the vehicle went out of control, went sideways, and Armstrong barely escaped with his life by getting out of the last spot.
This is the one where Armstrong barely survived. You don't believe that was in any way, shape, or form an attempt to take him out. I mean, he seems to have been the most faithful and loyal participant in the entire program. I mean, it was his name that was put out front as the first man to step on the moon. I mean, for God's sake, what a burden to bear when you know the whole thing's an elaborate fraud.
Right. The thing that's different today versus back then when they were doing this is that they didn't have the type of precision accelerometer technology and computational capability to actually stabilize this vehicle to give the astronaut an edge. In other words, they could have augmented the stability with a computer system that they didn't have in the latter 1960s. But today we have it. So it would have been very easy in today's technology to create the stabilization. Now, stabilization requires a very, very tight feedback loop between what is sensed by the vehicle, by the accelerometers, and what the engines and the reaction jets can do to arrest the problem. In other words, once the system starts to get more unstable by the second, it rapidly becomes a case where even all of the power that they have with reaction jets and even thrust vectoring, if they had a rotating nozzle underneath this, which they didn't. And by the way, they'd want that on the lunar, the descent engine on the LEM. They would have wanted a rotating disc so they could pivot that nozzle to direct the thrust, because the vehicle is inherently unstable, and they didn't have adequate reaction jet control that could have possibly recovered the control of the vehicle in the event they got it going sideways. So all the things that NASA claims about getting it right every single time without getting in serious trouble is completely preposterous, because they did not have the computational capability to do it. Like I said, there's no sign of an altimeter on the panel of the thing to show that the astronaut was going on.
Most Americans have no idea that the cheapest laptop you could buy today has more computing power than was available during the entire period of the Apollo program.
Right. They would have had a significant advantage if they would have had the capability that we have on our desktops today and our laptops, but they didn't have that capability. They didn't have the type of equipment that could predict what the mass of the vehicle was going to do if it got 2 seconds down the pike, because we can do that now. We know how to do it. But back in 1969, we didn't have that capability. It was all in the astronaut. And by the way, I'm not taking anything away from these pilots, because I'll tell you something. I'm an accomplished aviator, and I make no bones about it. But I'll tell you, no accomplished pilot could sit there in a LEM simulator and go 1,200 hours and not successfully land on a LEM unless there's a serious issue with all of the physics. In other words, these pilots, at the very best, and we're talking about every day they got up and they got good sleep before they went in. Presumably they were rested, had plenty of time to be fresh when they got in the simulator. None of them could land the LEM in simulations on Earth. And why would NASA arbitrarily take, Eugene Krantz, the mission supervisor, why would he have to make the decision to say, yeah, let's do it anyway? Because Armstrong said that he's got a 1 in 2 chance of getting it right, which means it was a 50-50 split. And I think he was way too optimistic based on the fact that none of them, not him, none of the other astronauts could successfully land in the simulation. Why did they think they could successfully make a lunar landing is another guess. But I wouldn't have given the go-ahead to launch the mission until these guys could get it down to where they could get 7 out of 10 attempts every single time. Because you can assume some risk, but you know what?
Sure.
It's way too much risk assessment here gone awry where they decided to go anyway when nobody could demonstrate they could do it once.
Here's something of some value. Glow of object tracks from bottom left upward angle to mid-screen beginning at 9:14. Anyone notice? Timing is everything. Dennis, I'm not quite sure what to make of this.
It's just a comment about more fakery on stuff. There are so many videos out there that are available, and this is just a demonstration of how many there are. But interestingly enough, some of the people that are commenters are not they're not throwing ad hominems and not attacking the naysayers.
Right.
They're making good, cogent comments about what they see,
right.
And they're not full of you know what. They're making very astute observations.
Now we have a series of technical papers you may want to comment on briefly. Here's Oleg Olenek of the Department of Physics and Technology from Kharkov State University in the Ukraine. All this had to do with the stereographic. You want to talk about that, Dennis?
Yeah, what you would be seeing if this animated GIF file that we're looking at here of the colored objects was working like it should, which it isn't now, but in real, if you go to the website aulis.com and look at these papers, you'd be seeing a very, very science-proven fact that gives you the ability to make very solid estimations about the distances objects are in the backfield based on stereographic parallax assessments. And the paper is very detailed. In other words, it's very, 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 there's no smoke and mirrors, there's no sleighs of hand, it's science. It's optical science. You cannot dispute it. And in every single case, this man has observed every single piece of photography that he has looked at that came from NASA proves that this whole entire thing was shot inside of a studio. He's even been able to map the distortion field based on the unusual shape of the screen in the back that they project some of the backdrop images in. And by the way, if you're unaware, we landed at many landing sites on the moon, but what NASA
ostensibly.
we didn't land at the same location, but in one particular case, I believe on Apollo 16 it was, the LEM moved around quite a bit after landing. We got it photographed in multiple locations other than the place it originally set down in, which means that either it has wheels on it, it rolls around a lot, just kind of like a dolly, or they fired up the engine and moved it and went someplace else, which would have hurt it. But the thing is, in more than one location shot where it absolutely.
A lot of options. Yeah, there's a very good article by Jay Wiener about the parallax argument that builds on this work in the book, and I suppose we didn't go to the moon either. So.
Yeah, it's science. It's proven science. We're not talking about somebody sitting here making conjecture. We can prove that this is reality. And here we're looking at a diagram about another white paper at aulis.com website where a very, very accomplished Russian physicist made the observation, studying all the videography and photography that proves that we had a velocity deficit that couldn't have got us to the moon in the first place. And when you look at that white paper, all of you that have extensive math backgrounds, I invite you to work his equations and prove where he's wrong, because I couldn't do it, and I've got a good math background. So go in there and look at this math, and you can see that there's a problem with the fact that we said that we achieved these velocities when in fact the measured velocities by photographic analysis proved that NASA constructively lied about how fast the rocket was moving. But actual observations based on video prove that we didn't even achieve the necessary velocity.
Yeah, this is classic physics. I mean, there's nothing arbitrary, subjective about this whatsoever. This is classic Newtonian physics, calculating that given the amount of thrust and so forth, they couldn't have put more than 28 tons into orbit, but according to NASA, it was actually 46, which means that NASA is off by a factor of, well, nearly 100%.
Yes, but the average American doesn't have the math background or the physics background to go back and fact check it, but it's the truth. This paper, by the way, that's published by this physicist is yet to be disputed by NASA in a way that debunks it. In other words, they can't do it.
Yeah. They'll ignore it, Dennis. That's a classic attitude. It's like the government's attitude to all the disproofs and proof. For example, the backyard photographs of Lee Oswald, where you involve pasting Lee's face on someone else's body in different positions, but the face is exactly the same. They can't admit it without revealing the whole thing was a setup, that he was framed. Just as here, they can't admit this without acknowledging the whole thing was a hoax.
From top to bottom, side to side, every bit of this is a hoax from end to end, and nobody...
There's no line of argument that doesn't lead to the same conclusion. Look at the spacesuit, look at the spaceship, look at the capsule, look at the photographs. Every line of argument, Dennis, leads to the exact same conclusion. It was all fake.
Right. Even when you look at the, we're not looking at a diagram about, but I want to talk about it now. They did not have the adequate pressure differential in the space suits on the surface of the moon to sustain human life on the surface of the moon. You needed at least a 5 psi differential within the suit. That suit would be very, very rigid. If you look at the cosmonauts on the Russian missions where they actually did real spacewalks versus fake ones that we portrayed with photographic fakery, their suits are very, very rigid, making it almost impossible for them to even move, because by necessity you have to have the 5 psi differential to keep your blood from boiling and from literally blowing up in your suit. And if you look at these suits, there's even one shot, we don't have it in this presentation, but there's a picture of an astronaut's leg where there's a through and through tear right through the suit.
Oh.
But by the way, the suit isn't even pumped up. It's absurd to be walking around as they did with I mean, it'd be almost as ludicrous as you could see his BVDs underneath the damn thing and know that his pants are torn.
Yes.
You can't have it both ways, folks. You either have to have perfect control or everything is lost. And in this particular case, we got proof of fakery after fakery, and because the American public is too gullible to actually look at things that don't look apparently very right. They don't do this stuff and then present it as proof that we went, because it's absolutely ludicrous to put this stuff up. Pokrovsky, by the way, this PhD did. This doctor here that wrote this paper, his paper can't be disputed by anyone. It's absolutely airtight. Anybody can cogently dispute this with real math, with real analysis, which NASA hasn't done. This thing's been published for a while. They can't dispute it. They have nothing to go against this guy's.
They're going to ignore it, as I observed before. They have no option, no alternative. Here's more of his study, Dennis.
Right. It's ludicrous for Americans. By the way, everybody in America, I got to tell you, you don't have the math backgrounds, you don't have the physics backgrounds. That's perfectly fine. It's all well and good. You're easily fooled by cheap sleight of hand tricks, strictly because you don't have the tools in your brain to look at something and go, you know what, that just doesn't work. Something's wrong here. When you see the lunar ascent module flying off the base of the LEM, as if propelled by huge springs that just got released by somebody pulling the trigger, something's wrong with your brain if you think that's normal. Because when you watch the Saturn V leave the pad in Florida when it took off, you watch it slowly rise up, and albeit, yes, the lunar gravity is 1/6, but you know what, there still would be an acceleration curve there. With a weak engine like that, it would have taken a while for it to get enough thrust to get it off the base of the LEM. And then furthermore, it would have to accelerate slowly, not be propelled like a spring flung it up there. And the explosive bolts wouldn't have the ability to force that thing into the air. We're going to talk about one other aspect about that that proves that that was fake. But
I like the fact that he says suspicions of the authenticity of the flights on engineering grounds are based on the fact that the NASA contractors progressed from producing very weak rocket engines. NASA first launched heavyweight satellites of 3 to 4 tons into LEO, a limited lower Earth orbit, in 1964, to record-breaking engines capable of powering a manned lunar mission in a suspiciously short time frame. But following the termination of the race to the moon, the development of these record-breaking engines came to an end, and the technology has not been used since. I mean,
that's correct. It's ludicrous to think that we did it. You know,
it's like the question: if we actually went to the moon in 69, 70, why haven't we gone back? You know, why is everything? We even had a NASA spokesman saying that the principal objective or obstacle to developing manned mission to Mars was the Van Allen radiation belt. And Dennis, you know, it's not that this is a new phenomenon. It's not that it only recently showed up. If the Van Allen radiation belt is a principal obstacle to making a manned mission to Mars, then it was a principal obstacle to making a manned mission to the moon. So, I mean, he didn't realize that in making this observation, he was demonstrating that actually it had been impossible to have traveled to the moon in ages past.
Right, and we haven't even begun to discuss the fact that once we got beyond the couple hours of transit through the deadly Van Allen, now we're out in space where we're going to be subjected to, during that time window, more than 1,400 solar flares. That 1 in 10 of every one of those flares that happened would have been so lethal by radiation exposure, would have killed the crew within 3 days. They would have died en route. They would have never made it.
It's actually an interesting coincidence that this was a period, an interval of unusual solar flare activity. In other words, you know, you could almost take any random other interval of time of comparable duration, and you wouldn't find anything like the intensity and frequency of solar flare activity as when we were allegedly traveling to the moon and back.
Right, and because of the frequency and the intensity of them, beyond the fact that the crew would have been killed, every bit of the film that they took to the up to the moon would have been destroyed en route, would have been useless. They wouldn't have got a single photograph. And if you want to dispute that fact, you want to talk to the people at Eastman Kodak, who started to have severe problems with radiation from our above ground tests because of particulate matter that drifted all the way to Rochester to New York and started to destroy their film inside the storage at Eastman Kodak before they could ship it to people to use it for x-rays. So there's a major problem with the radiation causing film exposure. If you know what a film badge is to monitor radiation, you know it's film. It's photographic film, and the degree of whiteness determines what the dosage rate was. And all of that film would have been completely, utterly washed out to total pure white by the time they made it to the moon. They couldn't use it.
I take it here, Dennis, we have some images from footage for the Saturn V booster that were basic evidence for his calculations demonstrating that we couldn't have put more than, 26 tons into orbit.
That's right. And when you look at this, folks, when you go to aolis.com and look at this information, now most of you are not physicists, most of you don't have the math background, but go find the most talented mathematician that you know at the university you go to and say, show me where this man's calculations have gone wrong, and I'm going to tell you they can't, because I checked some of the math and it's absolutely solid. It's not wrong. If you want to find a physicist that can dispute me, and this doctor, this PhD that did this white paper that's very, very, very carefully written. It's not half cocked. It makes very solid assertions. We couldn't have possibly lofted 48 tons to the moon. The payload would have been significantly less because the velocity we achieved was far under what we said proof is in the photographic analysis.
Well, it's all very thorough and serious scientific research where NASA fakes it. I mean, it's embarrassing, Dennis, that the United States aeronautical. I mean, it's totally outrageous that what we're practicing here is it's not even decent pseudoscience. Actually, it's pure science fiction.
Right, but like I said, the reason that they got away with it is that the American public really is not equipped to do the math. Just the mathematics alone, I'd have to say that not 1 in 200 students today could probably do this mathematics to verify these equations, and it's very true. When you can't, if you don't have the science and math background, you can't verify anything.
I think most high school students today could not pass what were 8th grade science requirements in the 1850s, Dennis. It's embarrassing, the deterioration in the quality of education in the United States.
Well, it's just like what George Carlin said about the American dream. He said you have to be asleep to believe it. During his dissertation, he talks about the fact that they want us to be just smart enough to operate the machinery, and that's about as far as it goes. And he was right, because they don't want people to be very bright. They don't want people to immediately smell the rat when they see something that's clearly fake. Now, when you look at the degree of fakery that they're even doing today with the International Space Station, which we're going to get into at the end of this talk, it's absurd that they would have to go to such extremes to do the fakery if they were actually really doing it in the first place.
Yes. Yes. So here I've been simply advancing with regard to some of the photographic evidence on the basis of which he did his calculations and determination that what we were claiming couldn't possibly be correct.
Yeah, his assessments are absolutely airtight. Like I said, if NASA could have debunked this white paper, they would have very adroitly produced a counter document that would have shot it right out of the saddle, but they can't do it because this is solid mathematical photographic evidence that we never went. This is proof.
Your results: examination of motion picture film record of Apollo 11 Saturn V flight near the first stage separation permitted the estimation of the actual booster speed. This analysis was possible due to the Saturn V using solid propellant retro rockets, which created an exhaust cloud. The result of this analysis was substantially lower, from 800 to 1,000 meters per second than expected, and substantially lower than stated in the NASA documentation. The calculations were obtained from 3 independent and mutually interrelated methods. Therefore, the principal conclusions are the same. The conclusion reaches a study of result of the study into the ability of the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket to place a stated payload into lunar orbit suggests that these findings completely nullify NASA's declared propulsion capability with regard to the Apollo 11 mission.
It doesn't get any more crystal clear than that. Like I said, NASA can't touch this with a 10-foot pole, and they don't want the public to see this one being contested because there's enough people out there in Europe that actually have math and science backgrounds that'll go, this man is right, Pokrovsky is right, and that NASA is full of you-know-what when they make these outrageous claims, when the very photographic record reveals that they're full of you-know-what, that they lied, and that they misled the whole entire Earth into believing that we flew a mission that we couldn't possibly have flown.
It is fascinating. It is fascinating. It is fascinating. Given these obtained estimates, all arguments over what could have been achieved during the Apollo program should take into account that not more than 28 tons, including the Apollo 11 craft itself, out of 46 tons, as stated by NASA, could have been placed into lunar orbit.
It's just math and science here, Jim. It doesn't get any more simple. But like I said, the average American does not possess the tools to make the assessment, and therefore they'll arbitrarily believe garbage that's been shoved down their
no competent scientist could seriously believe that we actually traveled to the moon. Dennis, I think here this is a replication of beginning again of the paper. Improved estimate.
You can go ahead and shuttle past this one, but the paper is very detailed, and here we got a nice picture of astronaut Dave Bowman in 2001 Space Odyssey. We just drew this in here for effect.
Yeah, this is a space suit scene in Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece. In fact, it's widely believed that Kubrick actually facilitated, that he was responsible for the faking of the footage of the moon landing.
Yeah, it's very clear that that when the CIA traveled to Pinewood Studios in London to go have a little chat with them, that they made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and he at least showed him how to fake the first mission, and then he probably stepped away from it and said, "Okay, gents, you got it now. You got to do it all on your own," because they did some minor deviations on how they did the fakery after the Apollo 11 mission. But it's quite clear that at the bare minimum, Kubrick was probably instrumental in helping them get at least some of this set up. But Kubrick only had so many tools in his box as well. He couldn't possibly create a star canopy that would have not given away the exact precise position of each lunar lander after it touched down. And there's a problem with this, by the way, folks. If you're unaware of it, as we stated earlier, we landed in more than one location, but yet the mountain backdrop in the far field is exactly the same one. In other words, think about this. It's like somebody showing you the Grand Canyon over and over again as proof that they went from, you know, the East Coast to the West Coast. I mean, it'd be absurd. But if anybody believes that you can see the same mountain backdrop in every single case at different landing sites, I think that at this particular point in time, you need to step out of the room because you're not qualified.
Jay Weiner demonstrated that it was done using what's known as front screen projection, a technique that yields a result that the background is just as clearly in focus as the foreground, which of course is an optical impossibility.
Yes, and you know, like I said, the stereographic parallax analysis method is airtight. You can't dispute it. It's absolutely airtight. And Kubrick showed us a lot of hints that he was preoccupied with Apollo 11 during the shooting of a movie that we all have probably seen called The Shining. Scene after scene after scene, there's references to Apollo 11, including sitting at a typewriter, typing what's supposed to say "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," but "all" is spelled A-1-1, not A-L-L. And clearly, this kid's sweater, one of the actors in the movie, reference after reference. Room 237, when in the script it was 213. 237 is the approximate distance between the Earth and the Moon. So many references to Apollo 11 here. I think this was Kubrick's way of subtly sticking a knife in the back of the CIA people that forced him to do the hoax in the first place. And if you watch this, you can see clue after clue after clue that Kubrick was preoccupied with Apollo 11 during the making of this movie and sent us many signals. Why he did it is anyone's guess, but to me, I think it was a roundabout way of getting back at the people that probably really treated him pretty rough because they were in a crunch to make the hoax and they needed his help. And I think if he would have had enough time to come clean, it would have been great, but he was, in fact, a genius, and I'll give him that. And I admired his work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he did a lot of first-time things with cinematography. He was an accomplished photographer, probably was an exceptional human being in every way, and it's a shame that he got dragged into this.
This isn't him as a young man, is it?
Yes, this is him. This is exactly Stanley Kubrick at a younger age. But he's a very talented individual.
Fascinating. Fascinating, Dennis.
And
what do we have here?
Yeah, I thought this was a good shot. I call this the inference of the Talmud vision, as I call the TV set. It's prominent in the script for 2001 in the story, where it was basically used as an instruction device or a propagandizing machine in some fashion. And like I said, this whole movie was so far ahead of itself in so many different ways. It is, of course, deviated from Arthur C. Clarke's story in many instances, but this was a work of genius that unfortunately got Kubrick wrapped up in the fact that the CIA, when they flew to London to go talk to him at Pinewood, that they grabbed him by the arm and said, "We got a mission for you that you have to do. You have to do it for your country. It's important. We can't allow for the Russians to have space supremacy." Unfortunately, for the whole American population, we were duped. The whole world was duped, and we never went.
What is fake space supremacy, Dennis? What's the value of that other than propaganda?
Well, it is propaganda, and the real effect of it was that it gave Americans this misguided and very stupid exceptionalism that doesn't really work in the real world, because we couldn't go to the moon, we couldn't overcome Van Allen, we couldn't overcome the 1,400 plus bursts of radiation from the sun on the way. We didn't have a rocket big enough to do it. Von Braun, in his own words, said that we needed a rocket many, many times larger. Then, of course, changed his tune later, probably because of the same CIA people had a de facto gun to his head saying, you'll do what we tell you, not what you think you're going to say. But we didn't have the technology to do it. It would have taken us easily a full decade of very, very hard testing and work to even make an honest, modest first-time mission. And let me tell you what really would have happened. We would have launched a robot mission to the moon first, and we would have had to have very complex replicas of human beings in the vehicles for weight purposes, for exhalation of water vapor purposes, for you know, we couldn't replicate the fact that they eat because they would be crash test dummies, but we would have had to have launched provisions to sustain them. We would have had to have a life support system on board both vehicles to be able to provide them with an adequate breathable atmosphere in light of the fact that they're in a capsule, they're not connected to an air conditioning pack on the Earth. There's absolutely no evidence in any of the drawings provided by Grumman or NASA that shows that they had the necessary air conditioning and life support material on board either of these vehicles to make such a long voyage with human beings on board. We would have done it first with robots. We did not do it.
And Dennis, air conditioning is highly energy dependent. I mean, you know, it consumes a huge amount of energy to cool down a certain area of space. And even if it's relatively small, that's going to be tremendous in terms of the demands for batteries, electricity, whatever.
When you look at the diagrams that Grumman showed us in their manuals for the LEM, they show what they call insulation schemes that are absolutely not workable in real life for any number of reasons. Multi-layers of mylar and ill-defined amounts of other material. They said that they hand crinkled it to maintain the random type of contact that you want between layers of mylar to make it insulating. But then they forgot to mention the fact that at each joint of the monocoque construction, now you got a problem because now you have convergence. Now you have thermal convergence. Now you have conduction. They didn't make any bones about how they carried a vast amount of heat being generated in the electronics out of the aircraft going to the moon. By the way, they rotated the whole vehicle at about 1.5 to 2.5 RPM. But I equate that to rotating a chicken inside of a rotisserie oven, because even though the chicken is being rotated where the heat isn't going to hit it at the same place, there's nowhere for the heat to go once it's in the chicken. It just keeps rising and rising.
They would have been baked just like the chicken.
Right. They had no viable scheme to carry the heat out of the vehicle. And we're talking about a hot environment for the whole entire, it was in direct sunlight every inch of the way. That vehicle would have accrued a huge amount of heat just on the transit alone, not to mention the heat generated by the occupants, and they would have had no way to get rid of it.
Here's a book review of NASA Mooned America. What NASA standing for Never a Straight Answer. Dennis, you want to talk about Thomas J. Brown or the book?
Anyway, this is by an author that's no longer with us, who, by the way, is very brilliant. You can find his work all over the internet. Ralph Renee is his name, and he's very, very, very brilliant man, and he puts things in layman's terms that you can't possibly dispute. And he only has a handful of photographs in this work. By the way, it's been removed from Scribd as a document that you could download for whatever reason, but they said it was for copyright infringement. By whom? I don't see anybody in Ralph's family that would
Dennis, they make this stuff up all the time. They're going through and, you know, trying to take down truth sites on all kinds of subjects, from Sandy Hook to 9/11 to the moon landing, on the basis of alleged violations of copyright. It's ubiquitous and it's disgraceful. I mean, it shows that they're at wit's end in trying to cope because they can't do it rationally. So they have to do it in an authoritarian and preemptive fashion.
Right, when they do this kind of censorship to keep controversial truth out of the eyes of the public, you can tell that this particular book is very damaging because it presents real science and real truth.
Here's a page on
NASA doesn't real truth.
Thermal problems. Space is supposed to be at absolute zero. Anything directly in the sunshine heats up incredibly. Skylab overheated when one of its solar panels failed to deploy properly at Apollo 13 in direct sunlight, and in a lethal radiation zone supposedly got cold. On the launch pad, the ship is air-conditioned from ground services. In space, it's air-conditioned, powered by fuel cells. If you turn off that air conditioner, the ship gets cold. At least that's what NASA's line of logic dictates. Tell us about this.
It's contrary to that. When this vehicle is in direct sunlight, it has a very big problem with getting rid of heat that it takes on.
Right. He was parodying, yes, what they were claiming, that if you turn it off, the ship gets cold, when in fact, actually, it would heat up massively. You're exactly right.
Right, and they had no viable scheme to get rid of the excess heat that accrued after the whole entire flight, almost 250,000 miles all the way to the moon in direct sunlight. How they got rid of the heat, it's virtually impossible. They had nothing on board to do it.
Shortly before the 1967 test pad fire that killed 3 astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chafee, Virgil Grissom told his wife Betty, "If there's ever a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me." Because he'd become a critic of the space program and expressed unease about the success of actually getting men on the moon. They set him up, they filled the capsule with pure oxygen, and then they set off a spark. I mean, it was outrageous, and they had him sealed in, Dennis. This was clear, cold-blooded murder.
The other thing that the public doesn't know is that all 3 astronauts, when they were autopsied, were found to have exceptionally high levels of cyanide in their blood.
Yeah.
So they were breathing a cyanide-rich atmosphere even before the fire started.
Yes. Well, they wanted to make sure they were dead, totally, completely, absolutely dead. Multiple causes.
And they tried to get out of the vehicle approximately 10 minutes before the fire. They started to try and get out, but once they started to make motions to get out of the vehicle, the steps were taken to kill them.
Yes.
But the one thing that the other people weren't aware of what happened in the case of Gus Grissom is that the FBI and NASA went to his home and ransacked it, took all his paperwork on the day that he died on the pad.
Yeah, that's
why would they do this? For what constructive reason would they go to the lengths of going to his home and taking every bit of his paperwork away from him?
Well, because he would have had criticisms of the program and explanations of his reason why he believed it would never work and why he had a lemon hanging over his desk. Get this, Dennis, this is rather devastating. With backpacks on, the astronauts would need about 35 inches of clearance to crawl through the 30-inch hatch on the LEM in the manner claimed by NASA. That's a pretty tight fit indeed, Dennis.
That's true. The actual real it's a 32-inch hatch, by the way, but it's still too small. And they would have had to go through that hatch with their suits on. With the backpacks on, they couldn't do it. And to me, it's impossible that they could have accomplished the docking maneuver between the LEM and the command module in space.
And this is a point you've mentioned to me before, Dennis. There's no airlock on the LEM, so how'd they open the door after repressurization and dump their suits in garbage without dying from the supposed vacuum and heat, or was that cold?
It would have been a massive gamble to ensure that they got the door shut quick enough to repressurize, because if the slightest hitch would happen, they would have died. And and they would have had to make multiple times, incursions in and out, out. I mean, over and over again, there's so many lies that you can't substantiate with any counter as to why they would, for whatever reason, pump the atmosphere, because they'd have to void the capsule to open the door. You couldn't just pop the hatch and go out and come back in and stuff like this. They would have lost an awful lot of breathable air. And last time I checked, I don't really see anything in the diagram that show that they had the capacity and the size of storage tanks for oxygen. Neither did they have the capability to generate oxygen in their own right. They said the fuel cells generated oxygen, but I challenge that. I really seriously do.
He also began with the photographic evidence, including And I think we have it here. Photo 1 from the inside of the book, Carrying the Fire, by astronaut Michael Collins, showing Collins in a no-gravity test inside an airplane. Photo 2 is allegedly of a Gemini 10 spacewalk. You know something fishy about the photos. In reverse, number 1, and size it, well, overload on 2, they match the same photo, simply reverse, Dennis. This is embarrassing.
But like I said, the average American never went to the steps to look at this stuff with a very critical eye and see that time after time after time, they show us fakery when they didn't have to if they really did these things.
I love this bottom point. The cover photo on the book shows 2 lunar astronauts, or astronauts, as Wren calls them, one reflecting in the other's visor. The reflected astronaut is not holding a camera, so who took the picture with only 2 men on the moon? Also, the same photo is a piece of what appears to be scaffolding with a spotlight on it appears on the left edge of the photo. I've seen the same photo in several other places, but it's always cropped so the scaffolding is missing. That was, of course, a stage light.
Of course it was, and there's even one photograph, and I can't really vouch for the authenticity of it, but it shows guys wearing black pants and white shirts and ties walking around by the limb on the lunar surface. You know, going over things and trying to pick up some stuff and smooth off, you know, get rid of artifacts that they didn't want to be seen on the next shots. But the whole thing is a hoax and it's fake. And let's put it this way, you know, everything is overwhelming proof that they faked it all the way across the board. You can't have so much overwhelming, unequivocally true evidence and proof without looking at it and going, you know what, it's getting pretty clear to me that we really couldn't have gone.
Here's a nice point, too.
Go ahead.
NASA allegedly shot tens of thousands of pictures of the lunar landings, yet it's very difficult to procure even a decent percentage of them. The same ones show up in most publications. The television footage of the first moon landing was very poor, while having access to the finest of technology, NASA would not allow a direct feed, but forced networks and news services to film through an optically enlarged television screen, adding quite a bit of distortion. And of course, that was the whole point, to make it so distorted you couldn't tell how effortlessly it was being faked.
Right, and they could have provided us with much more crystal clear images, but it was done on purpose because they had a great deal of deception going on, and they figured the more clarity would have revealed the points that some of us would have picked up right away. Like I said, when I heard no sound on the descent to the lunar surface, I knew it was BS. But the average person wasn't equipped with the tools to know, you know, a rocket engine firing would have made some noise, and the argument about the space vacuum getting rid of the noise is absurd when it's bolted to a surface right directly underneath your butt.
And here's the photograph flipped. I mean, Dennis, this is embarrassing.
It's criminal, actually. It goes in the direction of criminality. As a matter of fact, if we actually had a global body that could take the United States to court and sue the United States for the fakery that they committed on all these hoaxes, and that they're still committing today with the ISS. If we actually had a body of people that weren't bought and paid for, the United States to be paying out a lot of money in the courts for deceiving the population of the whole entire Earth about a mission that we never flew, and we never flew any of these missions to the moon. Van Allen would have stopped us. The interstellar radiation from the sun would have stopped us. We didn't have a rocket big enough. The list of things goes on and on and on. And then the only thing that they can offer up is, you know, only a retard or an idiot can say we never went. Well, I'm sorry, folks. Retards and idiots aren't who are debunking it.
Here he has this photograph of the 2 astronauts who are about the same height, and yet the one on the right casts a shadow that's about twice as long as the one on the left.
Of course, there's nothing wrong with that picture either, is there? And then, you know, it seems to me that it would have been nice if the clarity on this would have been a little bit better.
Yeah.
And I would have raised the game
ridiculous.
But most Americans wouldn't understand the issue here with the shadow. Now, this is a very good slide that you got up here. Go ahead with it.
Yeah, and Neil Armstrong says the sky is black, you know, it's a very dark sky. Mike Collins on Gemini 10, my God, the stars are everywhere, above me, on all sides, even below me. Down there next to the horizon, the stars are bright and they are steady. This was written 14 years later. And remember that the Gemini 10 spacewalk photo shown here has now been proven fake. Mike Collins on Apollo 11, I can't see the Earth, only the black, starless sky behind the Agena rocket. As I slowly cartwheel away from Agena, I see nothing but the black sky for several seconds. What I see is disappointing, for only the brightest stars are visible through the telescope. And it's difficult to recognize them when they're not accompanied by the dimmer stars. Gene said it on Apollo 17, when the sunlight comes through the blackness of space, it's black. I didn't say it's dark, I said black. So black you can't conceive how black it is in your mind. The sunlight doesn't strike on anything. So all you see is black. Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian cosmonaut. Astonishingly bright gold stars could be seen through the windows.
Yeah, there's a big contrast between what the Russians really did in space and obviously this scripted crap that these bozos wrote by their CIA handlers trying to describe space as being void of stars. Well, let me tell you something, folks. The stars didn't go on vacation during these space missions. They were there always. By the way, all we're seeing is an artifact from something that winked out millions of years ago that may not even exist today. We're seeing the light artifact. But there's so many of them that if you've ever been at sea on a ship, as I have, or in a cockpit high above the Earth, and look straight up into the blackness of space, yes, space is very black, but it's full of stars. It's full of stars. I'll put my hand on any Bible anywhere and tell you how many billions of stars I couldn't possibly wrap my mind around from both an aircraft cockpit very high above the Earth and sitting in a ship or on a radar platform looking straight up into the air, looking at a star canopy that just astonished me. All I could do is look at it and study it for hours. These guys would have been so awed out they could barely even talk from all the stars they would have seen.
And I know, Des, you want to mention something about the alleged thermal control coating.
Yeah, and then they don't even tell you what the composition of it is, and they're showing the impingement of energy, and then they have this little 3 arrows going up in the air. And it says surface spectral property, and then they have this goofy equation next to it. I mean, this is the kind of fakery your government puts out to convince the world. By the way, this is NASA material here. This isn't something I drew or some naysayer drew. This is the crap that they put out that's trying to convince us that this is how they reflect
and
the
for
heat
which
off
they
the
consume
vehicle.
vast sums of taxpayer money, Dennis.
Right, but this is the best they can come up with. This is the best they can throw. I mean, this diagram, there's another one we're going to look at here in a moment that's just as obtuse as this one. But the ships would have, these vehicles would have gotten so hot that they would have had to have continuous air conditioning, and they would have had at least a re-radiation surface on the vehicle to re-radiate heat into space, because you have a problem with no atmosphere. You have no
Dennis, we may not have the other diagram because here I have some from Jack White. He's got notice here, this is a flag that casts no shadow, a rather striking phenomenon. And what I like even better is the big Buzz above. You got Buzz Aldrin in the left side. He's got a big helmet, short legs, long arms, and chest area with a set of controls, but above, Buzz has short arms, longer legs, smaller helmet, and different chest controls. I mean, this is just ridiculous, Dennis.
Well, it's just a sign that that there's no consistency, and there would be at least something that you go, yep, that's so and so. And the thing that we can't be sure of, because they have these visors on these helmets, is that my contention as to why they had to have such heavily reflective visors is that anybody would have been able to easily see who is actually behind the face and behind the mask. Now, I can understand that they would need a little bit of metallization in the visor to protect these guys from radiation. In a sense that they couldn't, that wouldn't have been adequate, but it would have been a good start. But this heavily gold-plated crap that they show us here.
But Dennis, just look at this. This is supposed to be the same guy. On the left, he's got short legs and long arms. On the right, he's got long legs and short arms. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, I don't know if you know that they have like a stretching gadget inside the limb where you can put the guy on the rack and stretch him out.
There's something I've been eager to toss in. Jack realized that they'd taken a staggering number of photographs. So he added up how many photographs they had, and it turned out that they had taken 5,771 photographs that were taken in 4,834 minutes. If nothing but photography had been done, such a feat is clearly impossible, made even more so by all the documented activities of the astronauts. Imagine 1.19 photos every minute that men were on the moon. That's one picture every 50 seconds. This is purely qualitative, Dennis, but it's absolutely devastating.
Well, as you might imagine, that there's a lot of things that they'd have to do other than wield a camera while they're out there on the surface of the moon. And by the way, here we go again with the film being completely worthless because it was already exposed to the radiation for the whole entire 237,000-mile voyage already. So how they got any photography to actually show up is a miracle. But notwithstanding that, their job wasn't to stand there with the camera and snap, snap, snap. They had a lot of jobs to do up there. And if you look at the point that Jack White is making here is that they have an inordinately overboard number of pieces of photography for a mission like this. And it's uncharacteristic of a real science mission because there's other things that you need to do other than hold a camera.
And Dennis, this will be our last slide for tonight, where I look forward to having you back and we can explore other aspects to which we've alluded but been unable to pursue within the time frame, where we have the director who produced a new Pearl Harbor film turning to expose the Apollo moon hoax. I think this is something very much to look forward to. Yes,
but it's going to get poo-pooed and attacked, and there'll be a lot of ad hominem attacks against Mizuko for doing this, and anybody that watches it and believes it, they'll be attacked for being crazy. And like that one Twitter message that didn't really say anything, but it was highlighted by the idiots at, and I'm going to use the word idiots at Huffington Post because all they are is apologists for propaganda. And you have to be an idiot to just openly take your whole entire organization and lay it on the line as nothing but a propaganda machine. Because when you hang out a Twitter message, it doesn't say anything as a monumental step to debunk anything. It debunks nothing. All it does is it slings a giant, broad ad hom at everybody and says that you're crazy for believing we didn't go. Well, I'm telling you, folks, we didn't go. I'm not 99.9% certain. I'm 100% certain. All of the evidence proves we never went, and that's the summary of it.
Dennis, I can't thank you enough for sharing the time and effort to go through all the photographs and studies. I think you've done a brilliant job, and it required someone of your unusual combination of background and abilities in order to make this kind of a devastating critique. My hat is off to you, my friend. Brilliant, wonderful work.
Thank you, Jim. Like I said, the public, whether they believe it or not, they need to look at the science, and the science proves we never really went. We never went.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Dennis Cimino, for being here, and all of you for watching.